On the evening of December 23, 1999, inside the vaulted reception hall of the Sursock Palace in Beirut, a woman known as Anneliese Schmidt adjusted the clasp on a vintage platinum bracelet. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias and expensive French perfume, a fragrant overlay to the city's persistent undertones of sea salt and exhaust fumes. To any observer, she was the archetype of a certain kind of European expatriate, a German art historian in her early 30s, elegantly dressed in a simple but flawlessly tailored navy silk gown, her presence justified by her consultancy work with wealthy Lebanese collectors rediscovering their pre-war cultural heritage. She held a flute of champagne, her posture relaxed, her gaze analytical as she scanned the room, not for friends or acquaintances, but for the subtle geometries of power, security, and access. Her mind was not on the Christian Maronite wedding ceremony that had just concluded, nor on the complex network of family and business alliances being celebrated. It was occupied with the precise timing required to activate a burst transmission device concealed within the antique silver brooch pinned to her dress, a device whose signal would need to travel less than 2 seconds to a listening post in a rented apartment 3 blocks away before the frequency was automatically scrambled. Anneliese Schmidt was a meticulously constructed fiction, a legend forged in the sterile training facilities of the Glilit complex north of Tel Aviv, and her true name was Yael. She was a Katza, an operative for the Mossad, and this opulent Christmas wedding was not a social engagement but the culmination of a 17-month operation designed to place her within arm's reach of a man the Israeli intelligence community knew only by the codename Argus. The problem of Argus had festered within Mossad Caesarea department for nearly 3 years. An operational failure that grew more humiliating with each passing month. He was not a frontline terrorist or a charismatic leader, but something far more resilient and dangerous, a logistical and financial linchpin. Intelligence chatter, pieced together from fragmented signals intercepts and unreliable human sources, painted a portrait of a man who moved seamlessly between worlds. He was the primary conduit funneling funds from Iranian Quds Force proxies to Hezbollah's External Operations Unit, facilitating payments for arms shipments arriving in the port of Latakia, and arranging the sophisticated forged documents that allowed operatives to travel unhindered through Europe. Yet, he remained a phantom. There was no verifiable photograph, no definitive name, and no discernible pattern of life. He operated exclusively through a series of hardened cutouts, communicating via encrypted channels that were changed on an irregular, unpredictable schedule. Previous attempts to penetrate his network had ended in disaster. A promising Lebanese informant recruited in Cyprus had been discovered and executed, his body left in a car trunk at the Beirut airport as a clear warning. A sophisticated attempt to hack into the financial institution suspected of handling his transactions had been thwarted by an unexpectedly robust, state-level firewall, an effort that not only failed but also alerted the network that it was being targeted. The core of the challenge was the target's operational environment. He was believed to be embedded within Beirut's insular and fiercely protective Christian elite, a community that remained largely impenetrable to outsiders, particularly to Israeli intelligence services still viewed with deep suspicion and hostility decades after the civil war. Argus was a ghost haunting a fortress, and conventional methods of espionage, signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, and asset recruitment, had proven utterly ineffective against a target who generated almost no electronic footprint and trusted no one outside his immediate, inherited social circle. The strategic stakes were escalating. Intelligence suggested Argus was brokering a new and deadlier class of shaped charges for Hezbollah, explosives specifically designed to defeat the armor of Israeli Merkava tanks, making his identification and neutralization a matter of urgent national security. Through a painstaking process of elimination and data fusion, analysts in the Mossad's research division, known as Tsamet, began to assemble a theoretical profile of their quarry. They cross-referenced financial movements with social calendars of prominent Beirut families, correlating slight anomalies in banking traffic with guest lists from high society events. A name began to surface, tenuously at first, then with growing confidence: Ziad Hamdi. He was the second son of a once powerful Maronite Christian family whose fortunes had waned significantly after the Taif Agreement ended the Lebanese Civil War. Hamdi, in his late 40s, officially ran a high-end antiquities dealership, a business that provided the perfect cover for his illicit activities, allowing for the legitimate movement of large, untraceable sums of money and the shipment of goods in containers that were rarely subject to rigorous inspection. The psychological profile constructed by Unit 8200's Behavioral Analysis section was critical. Hamdi was not an ideologue, he was not driven by religious fervor or political conviction. His motivations were assessed to be rooted in a potent combination of avarice and a deep-seated resentment over his family's diminished status. He craved the wealth and influence he felt was his birthright and viewed his clandestine work for Hezbollah not as a betrayal of his community, but as a pragmatic business arrangement with the country's new power brokers. The profile identified two critical vulnerabilities. First, his vanity. He possessed a profound intellectual insecurity and an obsessive need for validation from the Western cultural establishment he publicly disdained. Second, a documented preference for sophisticated, educated European women, who represented an aspirational world of old money and intellectual legitimacy that he desperately wanted to inhabit. He was a man playing a role, and the key to his undoing would be to create a character more compelling than his own. The plan that emerged from this analysis was both classic in its conception and breathtakingly audacious in its required execution. Codenamed Operation Winter Bride, it was a deep-cover seduction, a honey trap of unparalleled complexity. The proposal, championed by a senior Caesarea officer named Elon, argued that since technology and conventional assets could not reach Hamdi, they had to create a human asset specifically engineered to appeal to his every known psychological vulnerability. This asset would not simply meet him, she would have to become a natural and unimpeachable part of his world, a process that could take years and carried an astronomical risk of failure. The obstacles were formidable and systematically analyzed in a series of red team sessions. The primary challenge was the insertion and maintenance of a cover identity in Beirut, a city with a notoriously efficient informal intelligence network where everyone knew everyone else's business. Any foreigner, particularly an unattached and wealthy woman, would be the subject of intense gossip and scrutiny. A single mistake in her backstory, a slip of language, or a cultural misstep could unravel the entire operation. Furthermore, the operative would be almost completely isolated, with communication with her handlers restricted to the most secure and infrequent channels, placing an immense psychological burden on the individual. The risk of compromise was absolute. An exposed Mossad agent in Beirut would not be arrested but would simply disappear, with her fate becoming a tool of political leverage or a grim warning. The plan's success hinged entirely on the creation of a perfect legend and the selection of an operative with the intellectual capacity, linguistic skill, and psychological fortitude to inhabit it without flaw for an indefinite period. The search for the operative led them to Yael, a brilliant but unassuming analyst working in Unit 8200 station focused on Syrian communications. She was not a field agent, but her file contained several markers that made her an ideal candidate. Born in Haifa to German Jewish immigrants, she was a native German speaker and fluent in French and English, with a flawless, unaccented delivery in all three. She possessed a master's degree in art history from the Hebrew University, with a specialization in Phoenician and Roman artifacts of the Levant, a niche but perfect overlap with Hamdi's legitimate business. Most importantly, her psychological evaluation revealed a rare combination of high-level intelligence, emotional discipline, and a capacity for compartmentalization that bordered on the pathological. Her motivation was also deemed suitable. Her younger brother had been killed years earlier in a bus bombing in Jerusalem, an attack linked to funding channels that ran through Lebanon. Her grief had since cooled into a detached, analytical resolve that the Mossad psychologists believed could be channeled into the sustained focus required for a long-term deep-cover mission. Yael's transformation from analyst to field operative was a process of systematic deconstruction and rebuilding. For 18 months, she was subjected to an intensive and grueling training regimen. She spent 6 months in a mock Beirut apartment, living her cover as Anneliese Schmidt, speaking only French and German, and interacting solely with trainers playing the roles of Lebanese socialites. Her art history knowledge was deepened to a world-class level, tutored by retired professors and museum curators on the Mossad payroll until she could spot a modern forgery of a Roman glass vase from 10 paces and discourse on the subtle variations in Baalbek pottery shards. She underwent advanced training in clandestine communication, learning to use steganography to embed messages in the metadata of digital images of artwork she would email to her gallery in Zurich, which was, in reality, a Mossad front. Her physical training was equally rigorous, focusing not on overt combat but on defensive tactics and escape and evasion techniques that could be plausibly explained as skills learned in a women's self-defense course in Munich. The final phase of her psychological conditioning involved a technique known as directed dissociation, where she was trained to mentally separate her core identity, Yael, from her operational persona, Anneliese. Anneliese was not just a role she was playing, she had to become Anneliese, with her own memories, tastes, and emotional responses, all carefully scripted and rehearsed until they were second nature. The construction of the Anneliese Schmidt legend was one of the most elaborate undertakings in the history of the Mossad's identity-forging unit. It began with the creation of a ghost family in Germany, a deceased father who had been a respected professor of classics at Heidelberg University and a mother who had died years earlier. This provided a plausible source for her inherited wealth and her academic interest in antiquities. A birth certificate, school records, and a university transcript were expertly forged and planted in the relevant German municipal and academic archives, capable of withstanding anything short of a direct, official investigation by German intelligence. A Swiss company, Schmidt Antiquities AG, was legally established in Zurich, complete with a physical office, a corporate bank account, and a functional website. For over a year, this company conducted legitimate, albeit minor, business, buying and selling small artifacts at auctions to build a verifiable transaction history. Yael, as Anneliese, began to cultivate a professional reputation. She attended academic conferences in London and antiquarian book fairs in Paris, presenting papers, written for her by Mossad researchers, on obscure topics related to her field. She was carefully introduced to the periphery of the real-world art community, making contacts with gallery owners and collectors, one of whom was a well-respected Lebanese expatriate living in Geneva. This individual, a thoroughly vetted and unwitting pawn in the operation, would eventually provide Anneliese with her letter of introduction to the Beirut art scene, the perfect, organic entry point that would bypass the usual suspicion afforded to newcomers. Every detail of her life was curated to reinforce her cover. She wore clothes from specific European designers, favored a particular brand of Swiss watch, and even had a carefully constructed portfolio of stock investments that matched the profile of a moderately wealthy, fiscally conservative academic. The final touch was the creation of a subtle but persistent personal tragedy, a fiancé who had died in a skiing accident in the Alps 2 years prior. This element was designed to explain her unattached status and her slightly reserved, melancholic demeanor, making her appear non-threatening and emotionally unavailable, thereby disarming the suspicions of the wives of powerful men in her target social circle. The technological support for Operation Winter Bride was bespoke and deeply embedded within Anneliese's personal effects, designed for a low-tech, high-paranoia environment. The primary intelligence-gathering tool was not a weapon, but a device disguised as a luxury car key fob, a brand popular among the Beirut elite. Developed by the technical specialists in the Mossad's NIVIOT division, the fob contained a powerful near-field communication (NFC) cloner. It was designed to surreptitiously copy the entire contents of a mobile phone's SIM card and internal memory with a proximity of less than 15 centimeters for a duration of approximately 4 to 5 seconds. The data transfer was passive and emitted no detectable signal. The challenge was not the technology itself, but engineering an operational scenario where the operative could bring the device into the required proximity for the necessary duration without arousing suspicion. This was the central tactical problem the wedding was designed to solve. Her other tools were equally subtle. The silver filigree brooch she wore contained a high-resolution camera and a burst transmitter. The camera was activated by a specific pressure sequence applied to the clasp, capturing a series of still images that would be stored in a tiny, shielded memory buffer. The transmitter, when activated by a different sequence, would upload the encrypted data package in a compressed, 2-second burst on a frequency-hopping signal, a transmission so brief it would be almost indistinguishable from background atmospheric noise. Her fountain pen, a classic Mont Blanc, was modified to house a sensitive audio recorder, capable of capturing up to 4 hours of conversation. It was activated by twisting the cap 1/4 turn past its normal closing point, a minute, an unnatural movement that would be invisible to an observer. All of these devices were designed with a single philosophy in mind: they were for a one-time, critical use. The goal was not sustained surveillance, but the surgical extraction of a specific data set at a single, decisive moment. Anneliese Schmidt's insertion into Lebanon was a model of operational patience. She did not fly directly from Europe. Instead, she followed a circuitous route, first spending a week in Cyprus for a holiday, a trip that was deliberately documented on social media through a carefully managed Instagram account created for her 2 years prior. From Cyprus, she took a ferry to the Lebanese port of Jouni, north of Beirut, arriving as a tourist. Her first weeks in the city were spent establishing her cover story in the most mundane way possible. She stayed in a boutique hotel in the fashionable Akrafi district, visited museums, and made contact with the gallery owner to whom she had the introduction from Geneva. She presented her business proposal. She was seeking to act as a bridge, helping Lebanese collectors acquire European art and helping European clients source legitimate Levantine antiquities. It was a plausible and potentially lucrative proposition. She was methodical, never rushing. She spent her days in the National Museum of Beirut or exploring the Roman ruins at Baalbek, taking photographs and making notes, performing her role as a dedicated academic with flawless consistency. Her evenings were spent at gallery openings and quiet dinners, slowly and deliberately building a network of contacts within the city's cultural elite. She never once mentioned Ziad Hamdi or showed any interest in circles outside of the art world. Her handler's communications were sparse and indirect. A prearranged phrase in a review on an international art auction website would confirm she had arrived safely. A new listing for a specific type of Phoenician pottery on that same site would instruct her on the next phase of the plan. She met her handler only once during the first 6 months, a fleeting, 3-second encounter in the lobby of a hotel in Rome during a business trip, where a newspaper was exchanged containing a microdot with updated instructions. The psychological pressure was immense. Yael lived in a state of perpetual performance, every word, every gesture, every choice of meal or clothing a calculated part of the legend. The isolation was the most difficult aspect. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, the constant fear of a slip-up, a cold weight in her stomach. The build-up to the climax of the operation was a slow, carefully orchestrated campaign of social engineering. After 6 months of establishing her bona fides as a serious art historian, Anneliese made her first move. She purchased a minor but beautiful Roman-era glass bottle from a reputable Beirut dealer, paying a slightly inflated price. She then discovered that it was part of a matched pair, the other half of which had been sold years ago to a private collector. Through discreet inquiries, she allowed it to become known that she was searching for the owner of the other bottle. The collector, as Mossad intelligence had known, was a cousin of Ziad Hamdi's wife. This created the first, indirect link. Weeks of patient waiting followed. Finally, she received an invitation to a private dinner party hosted by the cousin. It was at this dinner that she first met Ziad Hamdi. Yael's performance was masterful. She was polite but reserved, directing most of her conversation to their host and discussing her search for the bottle. She acknowledged Hamdi's expertise in the field but did not fawn over him, treating him as a professional colleague rather than a man of influence. This approach, designed by the behavioral profilers, was calculated to pique his interest by challenging his ego. He was accustomed to people seeking his favor. Her professional detachment made her an intriguing puzzle to be solved. Over the next few months, they moved in the same social circles, encountering each other at auctions and charity events. Anneliese always maintained a polite distance, slowly allowing a professional relationship to develop. She would occasionally ask his opinion on the provenance of a piece, validating his expertise while simultaneously reinforcing her own. The invitation to the wedding of the patriarch of a major allied family was the signal that she had successfully breached his inner circle. She was no longer just a foreign businesswoman, she was a recognized and accepted member of their exclusive world. In the final days before the wedding, the tension was palpable. Yael received her final instructions via a coded message on a secure, anonymous image board, confirming that Hamdi was the primary target and the intelligence extraction via the key fob was the mission's sole objective. There was to be no secondary objective, no improvisation. The plan was to be followed to the letter. The Sursock Palace reception hall was crowded and loud, a symphony of competing conversations in French, Arabic, and English. Yael, holding her position near a marble column, tracked Hamdi's movements. He was holding court, surrounded by a group of businessmen, laughing and expansive. Her opportunity would come, but it had to be organic, a product of the social chaos of the event, not a forced interaction. For nearly an hour, she waited, mingling, speaking to people she had cultivated over the past year, her mind a cold calculus of timing and proximity. The moment arrived when the band began a slower song and couples moved to the dance floor. Hamdi was momentarily alone, his wife having been pulled away by a relative. Yael moved towards him, her path seemingly accidental, as if she were heading for the terrace. She bumped into him gently, apologizing with a disarming smile. This was the opening. She began a conversation, not about business, but about the architecture of the palace, a neutral topic that allowed her to showcase her intelligence without appearing arrogant. He was receptive, his ego clearly flattered by the attention of the elegant European woman. He spoke at length, and she listened, her gaze attentive, her body language conveying a deep and genuine interest. As he spoke, he gestured with the hand holding his mobile phone. The plan had specified that a dance would be the ideal vector, but the social dynamics of the room made that unlikely. She needed another way. She guided the conversation towards a recent archaeological find near Tyre, a topic she knew he was passionate about. As he became more animated, she leaned in slightly, feigning difficulty hearing him over the music. In that moment, her clutch purse, which contained the key fob, brushed against his pocket where the phone was held. For a few critical seconds, as she held his gaze, the device did its silent work. She felt a faint vibration from the fob, a preset haptic signal confirming the data transfer was complete. She held the position for a moment longer, then pulled back, smiling. She thanked him for the conversation, mentioning that they should discuss the Tyre find further at a later date, planting the seed for a future meeting that would never happen. She then excused herself and melted back into the crowd. The entire interaction had lasted less than 4 minutes. The core of the operation was complete. Anneliese Schmidt did not flee Beirut. To do so would have immediately cast suspicion upon her. Her extraction was designed to be as patient and methodical as her insertion. For the next 10 days, she maintained her routine perfectly. She attended 2 post-wedding luncheons, finalized the purchase of a small Byzantine icon from her gallery contact, and hosted a farewell dinner for a few of the acquaintances she had made. Her demeanor remained unchanged, calm, professional, and slightly melancholic. She complained to friends about the difficulty of doing business in Lebanon and spoke of her upcoming trip to a ceramics conference in Florence. On January 4, 2000, she took a taxi to Beirut Rafik Hariri International Airport, checked in for a Middle East Airlines flight to Rome, and cleared customs without incident. The small data package from the key fob was now stored on a chip hidden inside the metal band of her watch. The brooch, its single-use transmitter now dormant, remained pinned to her jacket, an inert piece of jewelry. Only once her flight was in Italian airspace did Yael allow herself a moment of release, a single, deep exhalation in the sterile anonymity of the airplane lavatory. From Rome, she flew to Zurich, where she spent 2 days meeting with the Mossad front company that was Schmidt Antiquities, creating a paper trail for her business activities. It was in a nondescript hotel room in Zurich that she finally transferred the data from her watch to a secure laptop and uploaded it to a protected server in Tel Aviv. Her part of Operation Winter Bride was over. She then flew to a quiet coastal town in Portugal for a mandatory 2-week debriefing and psychological evaluation, a period of slow decompression designed to help her separate from the Anneliese persona she had inhabited for so long. The intelligence gleaned from Ziad Hamdi's phone was a strategic bombshell, exceeding even the most optimistic projections of the operations planners. It was not just a list of contacts, it was the entire architecture of his network. The SIM card and phone memory contained encrypted contact lists, calendar entries detailing planned meetings in Europe and the Gulf, and drafts of coded text messages. Most valuable of all were the transaction ID numbers for a series of offshore bank accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands, and GPS coordinates for dead drop locations along the Syrian-Lebanese border. Mossad's financial warfare unit, Harpoon, used the banking information to quietly drain or freeze millions of dollars, choking a key financial artery for Hezbollah's external operations. The contact lists allowed Summit analysts to map out entire cells in Germany and France, identifying operatives who had been dormant for years. Over the next 18 months, this intelligence led to a series of seemingly unrelated events. A major arms shipment destined for Hezbollah was accidentally discovered by Greek customs officials in the port of Piraeus. A senior Hezbollah procurement agent was arrested in Bulgaria on trumped-up tax evasion charges and quietly extradited to a third country. Several deep-cover operatives in Europe found their residency permits suddenly revoked for minor immigration infractions. None of these events were ever publicly linked to Israel. For Ziad Hamdi, the consequences were more direct. Within 3 months of the wedding, his handlers in Hezbollah's security apparatus, noticing the sudden and catastrophic collapse of their European networks, began a mole hunt. Their internal investigation inevitably led to Hamdi, the common link. Unaware of how he had been compromised, he was unable to defend himself. He was last seen being forced into a car in the Hamra district of Beirut. His antiquities business was abruptly closed, and his family quietly announced that he had gone abroad indefinitely for health reasons. For the Mossad, it was the perfect outcome. The network was dismantled, and the target was eliminated by his own organization, leaving no trace of Israeli involvement. The psychological cost to Yael, however, was profound and lasting. The process of shedding the Annalise persona was far more difficult than inhabiting it. For years afterward, she would catch herself using a specific French turn of phrase that Annalise favored or feeling a pang of nostalgia for the view of the Mediterranean from her Beirut apartment. The operation had been a stunning success, but it had required the sacrifice of a part of her own identity, a piece of her that was left behind in the perfumed air of a Christmas wedding in Beirut. The mission transformed her from an analyst into one of Caesarea's most valued deep-cover specialists, but the clinical detachment she had once possessed was now something she had to consciously work to maintain, a constant, silent effort to keep the ghost of Anneliese Schmidt from speaking in her own voice. What is the true cost of using the deepest parts of human connection, intimacy, trust, and intellectual rapport, as tools of statecraft? And can an operative ever truly come home when a piece of their identity is deliberately and permanently left behind in enemy territory? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.